that after many decades of advancing technology, here the chip is back in the center of attention again. And it's in the middle of that because there are two major forces. One, this continued push to still way more performant, way more capable silicon, and it in turn enables an unbelievable push towards software that will continue to change the world. Now, if you look at this, it results in one thing: smart everything. Now, the term smart is not really new, and if we take a little bit of a historical perspective at it, we can go way back in time. Let's just go a few hundred thousands of years, and we find, fire is a pretty good discovery if you have to eat warm food. Actually, if you go just tens of thousands of years ago, the plow followed by the domestication of the horse, and the wheel, of course, brought about agriculture, more food than you could eat, therefore commerce around it. If we go a little closer, let's say the end of the Middle Ages, you find a number of technology advances that have big impact. And then we move from centuries to just decades, and we see electronics showing up with major impact. And now we're talking about years for artificial intelligence. The speed of this is truly remarkable. Now, each one of these innovations has sort of the same starting point. Some aha insight, but aha doesn't do all that much until you wrap us around it, engineering. And the combination of that suddenly brings about some economic impact. It becomes really interesting when you look at multiple innovations and you fuse them together. And then, if you're in the right spot, you can now get truly exponential impact. And that is really the history of our industry. Now, the exponential impact can be in many different dimensions. It can be in the physical, the biological, in the intellectual, all the way to, as we all know with our kids, in the social space. Let's take an example of one of those that has touched many things. And for that, I'll use the printing press. If you look at the printing press, the ingredients, the ahas, are very simple. First, a limited alphabet, 26 letters, that in turn can be mapped in a set of building blocks that can be reused. Then you need some ink that dries fast, paper that stays in good form, and last but not least, the thing that pushes it all together. And of course, we all think Gutenberg was the inventor of that, and he was the most practical one. In all fairness, the Chinese had an equivalent capability, except their alphabet was just too large. You take this, and you find now the beginning of the Renaissance, which of course is a massive exponential impact in that within about 40 years, there were 20 million books being published, changing really a view of the world as it stands today. Now, if you look at these, you can see that there's similarities to today. Move 500 years forward and the alphabet has changed to only 2 letters. We're working on getting it down even further, maybe with quantum computing, a sort of a fuzzy 1 and 0. The 2 letters can be mapped to basic logic gates. They in turn accompanied by lithography, manufacturing, planar transistor transit technology, ultimately became design and EDA. And with it, the most amazing exponential in the history of mankind. And if there's one thing that exponentials have in common is they are fundamentally very impatient things. They hunger for only one thing. Can I get it sooner? In other words, can you shift time to the left to get the results that you were pushing for a while? Well, that is precisely the field that I've been working in EDA, where the first objective was, of course, diagnose what should be the things to measure. And in the late 90s, we introduced this notion of quality of results, time to results, and cost of results as something that applies fairly uniformly to any product one may design. Or if you're in the marketing side of the spectrum, it just means better, sooner, cheaper. Now, if you do that and you look at EDA, what can EDA do? Well, for starters, you have to put things on a computer. You capture the data. If you can capture the data, maybe you can model it. If you can model it, maybe you can simulate it. If you can simulate it, maybe you can analyze it. If you can analyze it, maybe you can optimize it. And if you can optimize it, maybe you can automate it. And as a fact, we do a lot of automation because reuse of IP is commonplace as you design very large chips today. If we take this picture now, and we apply it in practice, we know that time to results is often the toughest one. Because on the vertical axis, you see sort of the incompleteness or the uncertainty of what you're trying to do. And ideally, you would like to follow a monotonically decreasing convergence curve to finally have a design that works. Reality, as we all know, has a few challenges, and yeah, there are bumps in the roads and surprises, and you work hard, and then there's some more surprises. Many of you in the room have experienced that. And so as you look at that, more often than not, the actual termination is slightly beyond, or maybe a lot beyond, the schedule that was planned. This is where hard work and automation comes in. And so you push on the better, you push on the cheaper, and hopefully over time, you can get rid of those bumps and make the whole picture move back in line to expectations. Now, if we add it to this, now a new computational form, AI, what we now see is that it's very similar. Let's do 30 seconds on AI. We start with a view of collect the data, make a model of it, typically a neural network, use that network to learn, use the result of that to interpret it, use the interpretation, maybe for some limited action, and ultimately the holy grail, which is any form of autonomous behavior. If we apply this, we find that there are a lot of places where we can have impact. And one of the reasons we're so excited is because every vertical in the world will be impacted by these technologies. Let's take an example here. This would be an aircraft engine. You can actually create a virtual model, a digital twin of it, and then apply both simulation and learning to detect patterns, maybe from noises that say, oh, this thing has a good chance of getting a crash pretty soon. At which point in time, do not fly that airplane, send it to the hangar immediately, which changes the very business model of how one can look at the maintenance of a variety of things. And this is the essence. Every technology we are empowering now will change the business models of every vertical in the world. Now, we're making another transition in this process. And this process is the techonomics of complexity. Let me give you two dimensions. One dimension is technology versus the economics. The other dimension is scale complexity versus systemic complexity. And if you look at the first one, the intersection of scale complexity and technology, clearly that is Moore's law. 2 transistors, 4 transistors, 8 transistors, and so on, and we've done that for quite a while. The economics tend to follow somewhat. And if you want to build a fab, you know it's a little bit more expensive than it used to be. But it gets more interesting once you add systemic complexity, which is systems that have many different interacting characteristics. And the challenge here is going to be, are you sure it's going to work? How do you verify that? Oh, and by the way, if it's a very complex system, invariably it means that the value chain around this requires an orchestration that's quite amazing. And what better example than seeing the radical changes that we see in the automotive industry today, where literally automotive industry people are interested in chips. Who would have ever believed that? Well, with that, there's a lot of opportunities. And if we look at this, we see that there are also some additional challenges, specific automotive industry. Certainly safety is part of chip design, security, not to be hacked. And these are all requirements that are quite substantially difficult. If we look at what can be done today in the automotive industry from an electronic point of view, you see all the basic building blocks that are being constructed. And invariably, they are at their own architecture. They go through a set of boards that you deliver to ultimately get the final product, while partially waiting for the design and the manufacturing of the chips. And so this takes quite a while. And with this level of complexity, that is not the right way to do it. And so applying modern computation, i.e. simulation, or virtual prototyping as we call it, to model each one of the chips, model the board, and create a simulation model that then, by the way, can be duplicated fairly easily on a computer, and most importantly, be given to the software developers, of which there are many, and that have been waiting to check out the car. So that ultimately you can check out if what you're building is the same as what your intent was, but also to verify some of the tough challenges, such as safety and security, long before the parts actually exist. Now, if we go a little closer to our field of semiconductor manufacturing and design, there's a technology that follows this same model called design technology co-optimization. And the notion is to look at the most advanced structure, the potential for new materials as it's being used, and say, well, if I look at this, this stuff is unbelievably small. Could we actually simulate something we can literally sort of see or not see the layers of atomic deposition that you have here? And the answer is yes. Ab initio simulation now makes that possible, which then begs the question, well, could we use this perhaps to see if we could simulate different types of materials applied through a process that changes constantly, using lithography, also simulated, and on new devices to then automatically extract from that the parasitics and use those parasitics to create a simulation, a SPICE model, and the designables, jointly called a process development kit. Well, if the answer is yes to that, you can do something else, which is ask the question, what if we took this and now actually did some cell development on the computer again, use these cells to then synthesize and place them around an actual processor and see how good it is. Even better, if we did this and we then said, let's apply a change, in this case, let's say some process parameters, would it be possible to figure out what the impact of that would be on the final process? Is it faster? Is it lower power? Is it neither? Both? Whatever. And of course, traditionally, you would do this by manufacturing it, which is very expensive and takes a lot of time. Instead, where we're heading here is the ability to simulate. Well, if you simulate, why not simulate again and again and again? And then apply some machine learning to see how to optimize the broad set of these parameters. So this is the best example I could find of a really small set of devices that get simulated all the way to major impact. Now let me use an example from a completely different part of the spectrum, the largest example I can think of, where we model, simulate, analyze, and hopefully predict. But in this case, it would be climate change. Well, it has some of the very same characteristics, which is for sure, there's a large amount of scale complexity. Not only are there many locations, they have a large spectrum all the way into the atmosphere, and these interact greatly. But what makes this dramatically more complex is the intersection of scale complexity and systemic complexity, because if you look at the models used all the way back to the 70s, fairly simple model, here you see the 80s, here you see the first annual report, so they keep adding capabilities, second annual report, third annual report, and then they called it annual report number 4. And if you see this, you can see the complexity growing, and you may ask the question, well, how good are these models? So interestingly enough, they have combined all these pieces into a single set of macro models. And I was surprised to see the quality of the predictions. And so I want to share to you what I just found on this, which is, this is the 1975 prediction, and the heavy line is sort of the most important one in this context. Here you have the 1988, here you have a later one. And notice, by the way, you can now go both backwards to assess if your model was any good with the past data, and use it to predict better the future. Here's the last one that's been published. I think there's one coming out next year. What is clear from this, though, is that understanding that this is happening is a given. And we have all seen the dramatic economic impact of these changes. And I would say it's criminal to not take action on this. Now, my point here is not to be negative, but to rather emphasize that the opportunity to do virtual models of things has big impact in how we look at the future. Now, that is certainly the case in the field that we're in. And AI, or machine learning, or whatever your favorite term is absolutely sitting in the middle of this picture. And as we heard just a minute ago, there are a couple of key ingredients. One is that big computation is what makes it possible. Secondly, that machine learning is what is using this computation. And by the way, those two are going to drive each other crazily fast forward. Because if you're an AI algorithm, you have only one wish in life: give me more compute, which is all good news to the audience here. Third, there's massive data being generated by sensors all over the place. But last but not least, the place for the money is actually in the verticals. And this will impact every market we can think of. Now, if you look at this picture, this alone is central for the next 2 decades of driving semiconductor technology. But a number of other things happening around that. New materials are actually being considered with great interest. DTCO I just mentioned. Low power will be the single most important limiter from a physical point of view, so the drive will be on for that. Root of trust, making sure that we in the hardware can guarantee security, will be absolutely essential. 3D, be it inside of the chip, between chips, between different systems, absolutely key to bring it together. Edge sensors are multiplying overnight at a rate that is unbelievable, and they're becoming faster and better on their own. 5G will change again the communication level in the world. And then, of course, AI architecture will multiply because they're all optimized for one thing, which is how much throughput can I get? And the only thing I do is AI. Therefore, I can use the architecture to get benefits going forward, such as embedded vision, such as speech recognition, that are already transpiring in many, many practical applications. And so, in summary of this picture, to use sort of the Sagittarius of semiconductor, it's very clear where the objective is. This is where the money is. It is the vertical market. And automotive is so interesting because automotive is arguably so the singular most complex value chain ever built in any area. And if you look at automotive, it's being radically shaken up by the notion of AI, but simultaneously it's also getting a pretty good push by 5G, while its fundamentals of propulsion are moving towards electrical drives. So if you take AI, of course, the holy grail is autonomous driving, and that would allow for a variety of ride sharing. It would allow for the car to take care of itself, go wash itself, go park itself, you name it. Also, by the way, the car on its own can go make some accidents, at which point in time, that begs the question of the whole legal system, the insurance system, who has the deep pockets and how do they protect themselves. In parallel to that, we see rapid advances in the electrification of the car, which in itself is actually fairly straightforward, sophisticated engineering, but doable. The biggest challenge is the ecosystem around it, the infrastructure, all the way to the energy generation. Will it be green? Will it be available? How do you get it into cities? You name it. These are profound impact areas, therefore great opportunities. If you look at the notion of having a challenge of recharging a car, why not let it do it on itself? And what's interesting about that is that immediately begs the question, how do you manage that economically? Well, this is fusion at its best. You will need the capabilities of a car company to provide the technology, you need energy distribution capabilities, you need some billing system, and before you know it, you have the essence of fusion, which is brand new models of intersecting industries that have to really teamwork well in order to make this happen. Back to the car. If we look at the amount of data it can generate, data mining is absolutely essential, and it's also essential in order to drive the very ecosystem that the car will be living in, and that it de facto means government programs or large city or state programs will be absolutely necessary to make it happen. Already, there's a big hunger for all kinds of apps, and the apps could be the combo package of a movie and a dinner, including wine and not driving, for example. It can be an elder autonomy 10 years, where people that couldn't drive anymore can still be very mobile, all the way to the butler car that does everything the way you like it and optimizes for you. It does beg a little question around this whole privacy thing, but in many ways, a lot of people would argue it's already dead. Yet, this will be a very essential question of how society will deal with these technologies. But if you're a car manufacturing guy, you worry about one thing. Who owns the car and how long are they going to drive this? Because if it's shared, it has shorter life. Great. That's easier to keep the technology up to speed. But the other question is, well, who buys it? And if it is fleets, that is a very different business model. And by the way, if this is a fleet of trucks, for example, it begs the question of the 2 million truck drivers in the US. How many will actually have jobs? So there's socioeconomic challenges in this picture. Last but not least, there's us. We are the supporters of the technology that make this all possible, and it goes from deep silicon technology to safety to software, you name it. It's all sitting there. And so fundamentally, the picture that we're seeing here is a tech-onomic fusion in a picture of systemic complexity. And if nothing else, that requires a high degree of collaboration. Just a couple of words about the amount of data. We saw earlier some data points on the screen already. If you look at a single car, it has a lot more eyes than a single human. And these eyes actually see a lot of stuff. You can easily generate 5 terabytes a day. That is a lot of data to deal with. And so there are challenges in how do you get this to a computational farm to learn from. And you need absolutely compression. You cannot sell all of that, even on 5G. You then compute. The compute farms will continue to go rapidly, generating new insights that have to be brought back to the car to then be inferenced in the right situation and determine what activity, what decisions are being made. Which brings me to the last key topic here. The notion of software is absolutely essential in this picture. And if you look at software, in many ways it has a very similar characteristic to development of chip. It starts with a high degree of uncertainty, i.e. incomplete code, and it's aimed at finishing something on a schedule. And actually typically it moves very fast initially for a simple reason, which is reuse is commonplace in software. Open source code is readily available. You need a menu system, you just download one. It would have taken you many, many years to build. However, once you are done with the software comes the first set of verifications. And quality is one word, but security is now the one that can be the killer word. And invariably, when you formally do security checks on software, you will find a lot of vulnerabilities that have to be fixed. So that takes some work, and then you do it again. And you still find that there are more. And so this in itself will be a very key push going forward. If you're finally done with the security issues that you could verify, you do one more check, which is that open source code. That was so free, so good, so wonderfully fast. Unfortunately, contrary to popular opinion, has quite a number of vulnerabilities. And today, we can look at your executable and say, here are the open source pieces, here are the known vulnerabilities. You have to do something about this. And you'd say, well, this is a design flow that is a lot worse than what chip design has been. Chip design has been very strict, very disciplined. We need to bring discipline, I know it's a 4-letter word for software engineers, but to this process. And indeed, this is now actually happening because it's rapidly becoming the long pole in the tent for the system. And so the idea is, can we, while the software is being developed, constantly check for quality and security issues, and in the process, fix them as fast as one possibly can? Well, the answer is yes. We can do that. And by the way, we can amend it with e-learning that will give the opportunity to say, oh, this thing, you're doing this all the time. Don't do it anymore. And by the way, here's a little video of why it is and what are the alternatives. So increasingly influencing that process is going to become extremely important. By the way, on the open source part, there too, it benefits us to do these checks early in the process. And in this case, you see my red lines. The third block clearly is suspicious. And now you have to make a decision. Should we develop it ourselves? Should we fix the issues in the open source? Or is this really a hopeless situation and we have to rethink our overall schedule? Oh, and by the way, there's one other check that's often forgotten, which is, did you know that a lot of open source code has also an assumption that if you use it, your code becomes part of the open source, or that there are actually royalty expectations. These are things you don't want to know by the time it goes to market. You want to know it early on. And so here too, in the field of the software, a massive shift left is absolutely a necessity. Now, a lot of people, especially software engineers, who have said, if I have to do all of these things, it's going to take much longer. And we certainly thought so ourselves. Till we started to invest in this and discovered that in contrast to the expectation that layering all the requirements for security on top of the software development would create a shift right, so in the wrong direction. The reality was, by adding some degree of discipline, it was possible to actually make the development go faster. And I think this is a lesson that semiconductor chip designers have learned a long, long time ago, which is the more you can do things correct by construction, the better off you will be. And of course, the penalty on chip design has been enormous, because if you make an error and you find out late, it's a whole mask set, many millions of dollars. In software, it's been, well, send a patch, and if that doesn't work, send another patch. In systemic complexity size issues, you cannot do that. Everything will need to go to a much more structured approach in order to make this feasible in the right time. So in a very short amount of time, I've touched on many, many things. We talked about the fact that exponentials have existed in history for a long time, that we're privileged to have been part of the last 50 years, amazing Moore's Law exponential, that we're absolutely entering right now the next one that is equivalently high impact, that we are seeing this impact because the fusion of silicon and software opens up doors in a way that we have not seen since the early 80s in computation. We've seen that no matter what, you always need to keep your eye on three dimensions: quality of results, time to results, and cost of results. They always trade off. It's always a battle royale among them. And at the same time, we are now adding a new capability, AI, as a computational field on top of the traditional software computation we've seen in the past. Software complexity is a great example of the intersection between scale and systemic complexity. Bringing those things together on the example of automotive, but I would say frankly on every vertical, is what we are going to deal with. And with that, we will see some new demands that in the past were not top of mind for most verticals, maybe except a few where human life was in question. Virtual prototyping is a mechanism that is now available in many fields, essentially as a way to model what it is that you're building and try to forecast what the future will be. In that context, the automotive industry is as good an example as any of never having contemplated any of this until just 4 or 5 years ago, and now rapidly investing in chips, investing in prototyping, investing in the intersection of hardware and software, while having to make sure that the car stays safe and secure. And so in the midst of this picture, the one common denominator that all of the speakers today will have is that every one of us is trying one thing, which is shifting left, living up to the expectation of the exponential and driving it forward for the next 20 years. In order to do that, it takes two things: trust and collaboration. And I must say, we Synopsys have been privileged to be close partners to all the people you see on stage and a number of others. And so in that context, the two most important words of my presentation are very simple. Thank you.